Hello everybody, this week we're preparing for a conflict and tension assessment. In the assessment programme so far, we've been doing assessments on Germany and health. For the next 3 weeks, we're going to be doing assessments on conflict and tension. So this week, as always, there are 3 pieces of knowledge. The first one is on the Treaty of Versailles and German reactions to the treaty. We're going to be looking at the powers of the League of Nations, and we're going to be having a look at the Abyssinian crisis. Let's start then with the Treaty of Versailles. So what do we need to know? Well, the first thing that we need to know is that the Treaty of Versailles was the outcome of the Paris Peace Conference. So that had been negotiated between January and June of 1919. And so the actual treaty itself, which was all of that put together, became the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1919. So what we need to know at this point in time is, well, what did the treaty actually decide? What did it do? And for our purposes, there are 5 main things. The first thing that the treaty did was it set up the League of Nations. This was to be a new organisation which was to keep peace in the future and stop future war. And it was the only part of the treaty that was not about punishing Germany. It was about rebuilding a better world in the future. So what actually was done to Germany then? Well, there were 4 main things done to Germany. The first of them was that Germany lost territory or land. So what did they lose? They lost all their overseas empires. That's all the land they'd gained in places like Africa. And these bits of land were to be temporarily given to France and Britain as mandates to manage and get ready for independence. On top of losing their entire empire, they lost 10% of their European land. And things that we need to know from there are they lost places like Alsace-Lorraine to France. They'd gained that from France in 1870. And they'd lost places like Posen, Upper Silesia, the Polish corridor, West Prussia as well, very, very important. They also were told that they could no longer have Anschluss or union with Austria. They weren't allowed to merge those 2 pieces of land of Germany and Austria. On top of those changes in territory, Germany also lost some military. Their army, which had been over 2 million strong in World War I, was restricted to just 100,000 men. Their navy could now only have 6 battleships in total, and they were forbidden from having several things. They were forbidden to have conscription. They could no longer force people to join the army. They could no longer have any military aircraft whatsoever, and they could have no submarines due to the disruption they'd caused in the war. And the Rhineland was to be permanently demilitarised. The next part of the treaty was to do with war guilt. So this was Article 231, where Germany had to admit that they were to blame. They accepted responsibility for all the loss and damage to which the Allied governments and their peoples have been subjected. In other words, all the damage, all the problems caused by World War I was their fault. And that was the justification for our final part of the treaty, which was reparations. So war guilt and reparations are always linked. And they're linked because without war guilt, without Germany admitting that they were to blame, well, they couldn't be charged for it. Now they've admitted in the treaty it was their fault and that they caused all the loss and damage, they have to pay for it. And that was eventually set at £6.6 billion. And it was to be paid over a 66-year period. It could be paid in gold, or it could be paid in goods such as iron, steel, coal, etc. And as part of that, the Saar coalfields were given to the French to mine for 15 years because of the destruction of their own coalfields. So that's what the treaty itself looked like. So we've now seen what the treaty did to Germany. How did Germany then react? Well, German reactions were obviously quite violent, quite strong. So obviously the League of Nations was the only part that didn't punish them, but the Germans were excluded from joining. And therefore, even though this wasn't about punishing Germany, it still seemed unfair. They were being treated like an outsider, even though that they had unconditionally surrendered. And it was them who had ended the war. The war would have continued if they had decided they wanted to keep fighting. So this seemed completely unreasonable to the Germans. They were excluded from this organisation. However, that was the least of their problems. Bigger problems were, well, let's think about the land. Woodrow Wilson had talked about self-determination, both in his 14 points and during the treaty discussions. But what about self-determination for Germany? The self-determination was all about countries getting to rule themselves and different nationalities living within their own boundaries and borders. But millions of Germans were now, because of the treaty, living under foreign rule. This was a loss of the German homeland. The Polish corridor was a particular insult to Germans because Germans were now physically divided. East Prussia was a little island now, separated from the main body of Germany. And loyal Germans could not stand for this. They needed to address this. This loss of land was not to be stood for. The military was also a big problem for the Germans. They believed that the loss of their army put them in danger from other nations. They were now surrounded by hostile neighbours. They had countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, who had gained land from them or had been created out of the war, and they may be able to take more land from Germany in the future. That was a real concern for the Germans. The army, on top of this, had been a source of pride in German history. Remember back to the days of the Kaiser. Remember the fact that Germany had actually been created out of war. So to see it reduced to this level was not something that proud Germans could put up with. So they're really angry. They are excluded from the League. They're really angry. They've lost all of this territory. And on top of this now, they've also lost this source of pride in their military, and they feel vulnerable to attack. What about war guilt? Well, the Germans, despite the fact they signed the treaty, they had to, otherwise the war would have continued, they did not believe that they had started the war. They believed it was Russia. And there was some truth in that. They had made the first move. And the Germans said that it was the Russians that triggered Germany's reaction and Germany going to war. And this also seemed as fair, as I mentioned before, they had not been defeated. They'd signed an armistice. So the fact that they were then having to accept guilt seemed completely wrong. And it seemed like it was simply an attempt to humiliate Germany. It also seemed like it had been put in place to force Germany into paying compensation. So remember what I said on the last slide about war guilt and reparations being linked. That continues here with the reaction. So German newspapers claim reparations for this attempt to starve German children. And they were angry they had to pay anything because remember, they don't believe that they were guilty. They already had massive war debts and they believed that it was not possible to pay back the amount that were being forced to, that 6.6 billion. So overall, the Germans were shocked, angry and humiliated by this treaty. So our next area to investigate this week is a really little one. It's about the League of Nations and the powers that they had. So as we already know from the stuff that we've looked at so far, the League of Nations had been set up after the war to try and avoid anything like World War I from happening again. It wanted countries to work together. That's what the League was all about. So it was about working together to avoid things like World War I again. However, it realised that simple negotiation would not always work and that powers of enforcement would be needed to make countries stick to the rules. The rules of the League of Nations was called the Covenant. So in order to make it very, very clear what would happen if countries broke the rules, there were several powers which were known as sanctions for countries who broke those rules or the Covenant. And the first of those three was moral. So if a country had broken the rules, they were condemned. What that meant was they were simply told off by the members of the League of Nations. The League of Nations would tell them that their behaviour had been wrong and they should stop with that behaviour. If that didn't work, you could move up to the next level because all of these are kind of interlinked. You'd go next to economic, and that would be to stop trading with any country that had broken the rules. That was going to be much more harmful than the first one because obviously the League was supposed to have a huge membership, and then if countries weren't trading with that one particular country, they would really feel the pinch economically. And if that still didn't work, you could then move up to the next level, and this would be to use physical force, to invade, to forcefully stop the country from doing what they had been doing. So what were the issues or problems with these powers? Well, the problem with the moral sanctions is they could be easily ignored. Many countries would not see this as a real punishment. It was simply telling off. Any determined country would not be deterred by this. If they wanted to invade a country, the League of Nations telling them off was never going to stop them. Economic were definitely a better idea, but not all countries were part of the League. So Economic sanctions wouldn't work. It relied on all countries breaking off trade with those who broke the rules. Limited membership meant that it was unlikely to have the impact that it needed, especially with the absence of America. America was the world's #1 trading nation. Without them as a member of the League, economic sanctions were always going to be really limited. Also, even countries who were part of the League, well, they didn't always want to use economic sanctions because it would harm their trade too. And in particular, economic sanctions really weren't used after the Depression because countries were so desperate for trade, they weren't going to stop trading with other people just because the League told them to. So economic sanctions, a good idea in principle, but really unworkable without USA and with an economic downturn and depression. The third and final power of the League of Nations, of course, was military sanctions. But there was no army. They couldn't enforce military sanctions. This meant it relied on leading members to lend the League their army in a time of crisis. Countries like Britain and France, they had their own interests, particularly their own empire to protect, and they would not help the League if these were threatened in any way. So Britain and France put themselves in front of it. So when you look at all of these powers as a whole, what it meant was that the League was largely powerless in a crisis. They had to hope that countries would cooperate. They had to hope that if they told countries off, that countries would say, oh yes, we're going to stop this behaviour now. Or that if they stopped trading, they wouldn't trade with some of those other countries outside of the League. Or they hope that, Britain and France may in the future lend their army out. The powers were extremely weak. Our final area to look at this week is to look at the Abyssinian crisis. So just a very general bit of knowledge before we move on to that. So we're going to look at the challenge of the 1930s. We've just seen that the League of Nations was restricted in terms of its power anyway. But things got worse in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. Countries became more and more desperate because of their dire economic circumstances. There was a drop in world trade. Countries like Japan and Italy, they needed more raw materials and they wanted to divert public attention from economic problems at home. So they needed to do something to get the people back on side. And in 1931, in order to divert attention from the economy and the depression and from the lack of world trade and to gain more raw materials, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria. The League had not acted swiftly, they had not been decisive, and the Japanese got away with it. That's the background to what happens next in Abyssinia. So a couple of bits of background there. So between 1880 and 1890, Italy had tried to establish its own empire in Africa. They'd got some success and they'd gained parts of Somaliland and they'd gained Libya. So this was good for Italy. But in 1896, they'd tried to take over part of Abyssinia, but they'd suffered a really embarrassing defeat. The Italians were desperate for revenge for that defeat. And just like I've already mentioned, the Great Depression had massively hit. Italy was really suffering, so Mussolini wanted an opportunity to distract the Italian people from the problems at home. They were still really suffering in 1934, 1935. And it was about him trying to get greater popularity. So that's the background to what's coming next. Here's what happened then. In December 1934, there was a skirmish at Walwal on the Somalian-Abyssinian border. Italian, around 30 and 100 Abyssinian troops were killed. Mussolini said it was the Abyssinians' fault. He was determined about that and he prepared to invade. And he wasn't quiet about that. He was very, very clear about what he wanted to achieve and how Italy had been wronged. So this was all about him wanting revenge. This little battle had happened between the two countries, and it's about Mussolini thumping his chest and saying, I want satisfaction, I want revenge. So the League, a couple of months later, we're moving now into 1935 and into the February, the League set up a commission and they investigated what was going on with the incident. Who was wrong, who was right. Now notice the lack of speed here. The The skirmish had been, the kind of little battle had been in December 1934. The League had begun investigating in February 1935, and it still takes another 7 months from that point for the League to come up with a report. So altogether, this is 9 months from the incident, and it suggested giving part of Abyssinia to Italy. So it was seen that the Italians, did deserve a little bit of compensation. Well, Mussolini, knowing that really they didn't deserve any compensation, he was like, oh, the League are really, really weak. So the next month, so the report comes out in September, the next month, Mussolini now feels really confident. He's like, the League are completely weak. So he rejected their plan and he began the invasion of Abyssinia. The League at this point did take some action. They banned arms sales. They put sanctions on rubber and metal. Well, these sanctions actually were quite damaging to Abyssinia, more than they were to Italy. But very, very importantly, what they didn't do was they didn't close the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal allowed the Italians to get their troops and their weapons and all their equipment to Abyssinia to fight the Abyssinians so much more quickly. Had they had the canal closed to them, the invasion would have been almost impossible. What the League also didn't do was they didn't ban oil and coal sales. These actually would have stopped the invasion dead in its tracks. So the League could have stopped this, but they didn't. So Italians were able to get their troops into Abyssinia much more easily now. And again, Mussolini was now even more confident that the League would not stop him, because even when they have used their powers, they've really shown that they're not particularly interested in stopping him. This is the next part of the story. So Italy has begun their invasion in October 1935. The League doesn't really know what to do. They've tried economic sanctions, they haven't really worked. So Britain and France in the background are secretly negotiating. So Samuel Hall and Pierre Laval from Britain and from France, they come up with a secret plan to give most of Abyssinia to Italy. And this was because they were concerned about their own empire in the region. They both had empire in Africa. And they also both had economic problems from the Depression. So they thought, well, let's just give Mussolini what he wants. That way, this problem can go away. They also were worried about the growing strength of Germany and of Hitler, and they wanted Mussolini as an ally. They thought if they gave this to him, it'd stop him becoming an ally with Hitler himself and making Hitler even more powerful. Now, the pact where they were going to give Mussolini most of Abyssinia, it never happened. Damaged the reputation of the League because it showed that its two leading members, Britain and France, were willing to go behind the back of the League of Nations, and this convinced Mussolini that he could invade without fear. So by December, Mussolini is delighted. He continues with his invasion, and by May of 1936, he's completed his conquest. There is no further action taken by the League against the Italians. Haile Selassie, the exiled leader of Abyssinia, he went to the League of Nations and he begged for help. He was ignored, completely ignored. So what were the results of this crisis? Well, the result was, in the words of A.J.P. Taylor, who was a famous historian of the time, he said that it proved the League to be a useless fraud. It was pretending to stand up for peace. It was pretending that it was there to stop war. Actually, it wasn't doing any of that. And what it demonstrated was that the League was slow, 9 months to take any action whatsoever. It was powerless. It had no army. Economic sanctions couldn't work. And it was ineffective. The League was also, as demonstrated by this event, not serious about its main aim of stopping war. It was not willing to defend weaker countries. Haile Selassie begged for help and was ignored. It was dominated by self-interest, particularly of Britain and France. And from this point onwards, Britain and France adopted their policies of appeasement. All they were going to do now was try and give in, as long as the demands that were made seemed reasonable and allowed them to keep their gains. 9 countries left the League in the wake of what happened in the Abyssinian incident. And this was the event that was truly seen to have killed off the League. The Manchuria Affair started the death, Abyssinia finished it off.